So
Yeah.
Hi.
we can hear everybody. Great. So I'll call the meeting to order. It's Wednesday, October 27th at 6:30 p.m. And this is a meeting of the Fiber Broadband Completion Task Force. I'm Mark Howell, the chair, and I'll just do a quick roll call. Gordon Brockway,
Present.
Scott Hopkinson,
Present.
David Hessel,
Present.
and Gail Heyer.
Present.
Great. So we have our little awkward moment of assigning a clerk for tonight. If anyone is willing to step up and take on that role.
Well, I'll volunteer, except my daughter has just gone into labor. So it may be a bit before we get the minutes.
So if that's a volunteer, we'll take it. And I
This
hope
could be
you get delayed for good
task.
reason.
I'm sorry?
I hope you get delayed for good reason.
It started last night, and so it's been a little slow.
Oh, I do hope everything goes well. Thank you, David.
6:33.
Yeah. And this is, once again, one of our sort of investigatory meetings. We're just beginning to take a look at what data we have and what we can learn from it and how we can develop it. And I don't have any new versions of minutes for the two meetings that are still outstanding, October 7th and October 21st. Gail, I need whatever your final edits were for the 14th so I can actually submit them.
Okay. Yeah, I thought I had sent those, but I'll do that.
And I'll double check to make sure that I didn't miss something, but I'm making a note more for myself that they haven't gone into the clerk yet.
Okay.
Which is like the final step. And once that's done, we'll be finished with those that were approved last week. Okay. And again, we're meeting on a Wednesday evening for the convenience of one of the committee members. Wednesdays are slightly better days for me, but we can go back to Thursday. As I mentioned last week, next Thursday, November 4th, there is a Finance Committee capital planning meeting, and despite good intentions to find out more about whether it was useful for us to be there or not, I have not done that. So there is a little bit of a conflict with that. So any comments, preferences on schedule going forward as opposed to?
I'm actually okay with moving to Wednesday in general.
Wednesdays are generally good, except the Board of Concord Green meets on Wednesdays on the third Wednesday of the month.
Okay. Gordon, do you have a preference one way or the other?
The light board meets on Wednesday mornings on the second Wednesday of the month, so it'd be a pretty heavy day for me.
Okay.
I mean, I can handle it probably in November, but if my work schedule changes, then all of a sudden I'm absolutely really busy. I haven't been that busy lately, so I can handle it right now, but as a rule, it's probably not a great idea.
And Gail, do you have a preference one way or the other?
I guess I don't really have a preference.
Okay. All right.
I'm pretty equal on those 2 days. So.
Okay. Great. So let's I'm pretty interested in the Finance Committee thing next week myself, and so how do we feel about maybe we'll meet on the 3rd next week, which would be a week from today, and that'll leave us open to also understand what's going on in the Finance Committee Wednesday, and then we can, if necessary, go back to Thursday the following week. If that meets with everybody's schedules for the moment, then I'd like to consider that option.
Yeah, and you may also want to do the Wednesday instead of the Thursday of Thanksgiving week.
I'm pretty sure I want to not meet at all on Thanksgiving week.
Okay.
Because people like to travel and
Yeah, I actually, even the week before Wednesday versus Thursday would be better, but that's fine.
And the schedule that we talked about a couple of weeks ago when we sort of looked out over the whole fall, I specifically eliminated Thanksgiving week from that.
Okay.
Just, you guys are real troopers for keeping up with this. So I don't want to, not Scrooge.
It's been a little tense, but worthwhile. Yeah, no doubt.
Worthwhile, great. So we have, so that was the two things that I had on that. We have Jill Moonheron has joined, and we have a couple of members of the public doing. So we have basically two topics that we were going to do today. Scott, you were going to sort of do a little bit of an overview. We've talked around it a couple of times of what was in the business model. And this is kind of following up on last week's discussion of the finances, just a sort of a general idea of what we've modeled out as the characteristics of the subscription business that is broadband, as a way of sort of rounding out our financial, our first pass financial understanding of the service. And then I distributed Jill's work, which is an initial collection of data around parcels, streets, and the master address table. And she has graciously agreed to help us understand what's in those spreadsheets so far. And I think give us a little bit of a view of the map that she's produced. And I think of this as the raw data that we have already around what areas of the service territory are not served. And then we should, we'll need to enhance that data to provide the levels of understanding that might form a plan. So without further ado, then let's dive into the first thing, the telecom business model from the 2015 plan. Scott, do you want to share your screen?
Yes.
Okay.
And I apologize for the.
Guido.
Guido Sarducci.
Yeah.
Love it.
So what I've done here is I created a presentation, and then we're going to actually look at the spreadsheet in a minute. But I thought it would be easier for people to see some of the key elements of the model in PowerPoint form. And then so what the agenda for today is to review that financial model, talk a little bit about the assumptions we made for expenses and income, talk about sort of the summary, and then I wanted to move this into a separate section. If we have time, we'll just kind of make a judgment. There's a few slides that I've grabbed out of the study that went with this that might be interesting to just briefly touch on, just so people understand the background of the model. And what I identified as the quote work to be done is to, as Mark had mentioned, that while he was with the town, he had updated this model, but this model the version I have has not really been updated since it was generated back in April of 2013, leading into the first authorization for funding for the Concord broadband. And so it may or may not be part of what we want to do as we think through capital investment variations and things of that nature, to update this model with actuals and then use it to kind of think through future stuff. And that's something I'd be willing to do. So let's just jump right into it. The way the model works is the idea was that there's a summary page which we use to capture different scenarios and look at some of what we thought were the key financial elements of it. So typically what we would do in the model, and the idea of the model was to build a framework by which other scenarios could be evaluated. Nominally, we used a number closer to $75 to $85 per month for the service. We used a number around $200 for the initial install. I think the current number is $179. The model supported either a flat rate of installs at 15 per month or a profile, which we put into the model so you could select between those. And then we did a couple calculations out of each one of the instances of each configuration of this model. So this model does not include all these different scenarios in the sheets. So it actually had to be the summary was captured after we modified the model to meet those needs, and then kind of went back and wrote this into the summary and then tried another configuration. So this is just a capture of those configurations that were tested. So one of the things that was a key element of this was the amount over time, what was the maximum amount of cash needed to get back to a point of net cash zero and cash neutral. In other words, net cash zero, meaning the debt would be retired completely based on the model we had, which of course, as we go through this, you'll see that there are a number of assumptions we made that were not accurate. And, you know, and that's why I said that we should probably consider updating this to what the real world experience has been. So in each one of those models, we said, how many months would it take to get there? And so you can see that this is in the 5, 6, 7 year range. The number of customers necessary to get to that point, which is clearly less than the number of customers we have now. And then I added 2 other calculations. One was the percentage of the total available market. So this is actually, we assumed for the purposes of this model that there were 6,800 homes and 150 businesses. And I must admit, this model very much overlooked multi-tenant buildings because we were trying to build the base framework for what this would look like. And so what we were assuming for these different scenarios was a fairly low level of penetration in the market for that reason. And then we actually used this other percentage, which is a little bit, if we said only 25% of the total available market was available through Concord Broadband, what percentage of that market would be achieved? And so that's really kind of a compounding of those 2 numbers. But so the key takeaway when we were working with this model was to look at this number, the maximum cash needed, because we wanted to make sure, after looking at other organizations that had attempted to build their own broadband, the amount of dollars involved, the capital investment, and this included Google Fiber, Provo, Utah, a company called Western Integrated Networks, which has actually used the Avaya switch that I was involved in. They all predominantly ran out of capital. You know, it's a fairly capital intense problem to put that infrastructure in place. So I'll go on and go through this. Feel free to interrupt me if you have questions. So here are some other, you know, this is zoomed in so you can see 3 models that we did. This is just zoomed out a little bit on the same sheet with some other models. So we tried either 10 or 15 per month, or this profile, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then again, looking at the maximum cash and other attributes and the number of customers involved. And obviously, whenever you slow down the rate of install, then you get to a cash neutral position sooner because of the install cost it drags down the net cash. These charts these graphs we looked before, so this is just one example of what happens from a cash investment viewpoint when you start doing this business, where the front end you're continuing to invest in installs, and somewhere out in the period of 3-ish years, the revenue from the monthly service fees begins to overtake the cost of continued installs. And that's, so you sort of turn this curve from going down to flat and then starting up. And then so this would be the cash neutral, and that's the net zero of loan, which is, again, like I said, out in the 75-month kind of time frame is what we anticipated based on the modeling that we did for the program. And, you know, again, one thing to say about this model in general is that the assumptions we made are not particularly accurate to the reality of what the business looks like in some respects. So I want to just touch on that a little bit. Let me just talk about what are the components of the model. If you look at it from a spreadsheet viewpoint, there's the summary tab is the summary of the different scenarios, which is what I just presented. The next one is basically a financial profile month by month for up to 120 plus months. We created So that profile would either be populated with a fixed rate of installs per month, and we tried 15, 20, 30 per month kind of range. There may have been a 40 in there. Let me go back and look. I don't remember if we did 40 or not. I didn't see it. And then some personnel cost assumptions. And then there were a couple sheets that we did where we actually brought information about the smart grid in because of the concern to make sure that we addressed what was fair for the broadband business to reimburse the smart grid. So we came at it a couple different ways, and I'll talk a little bit about that. That's not particularly relevant to what we're working on now, but it is what gives you insight as to how we came to that conclusion. And then some early, just one tab just has what we thought might be the timeline for getting going with this, because it looked realistically, and Mark probably knows the details of what actually happened and how long it took from the time the town actually improved the funding to the time that they started hooking up customers. I think we looked at something on the order of 6 months to get to the first customer install. And then there was a list of, as I worked on this model, I kept a to-do list of things that would need to be, might be considered to modify the model. This sheet, this is an extract from the first few months of the model, just to show you how the calculations were done. So here you see month 1, 2, 3, 4, we just numbered them generically. And the costs that we assumed go down the left here. So bandwidth purchased, how much did we purchase? So it generally went from 100 or 200 up to 500. And of course, nowadays we're buying much more bandwidth. We made an assumption of a cost per megabit per second of bandwidth, and you can see that that goes down even in the first months because we knew the peering cost was going to be going down. We made an assumption about the steady state consumption of a customer to try and understand what the cost or what the impact of that is. And as we had more customers, that number actually went down. The number of installs per month we've talked about. So here it shows going from 10 to 15. And if you look out in the spreadsheet, I think it goes up. And then total installs is just the cumulative sum of all that. The next portion is calculating the sum of the installs. This is just for the first year, this column on the left here, because we were kind of interested to look at the first year. So there would be install costs for the first year, bandwidth costs. So 163,000 for the installs of the first year based on that rate above. Cost for the network facility, which we anticipated would be mostly upfront. Dedicated staffing and shared staffing. So when we tried to do this model, we said, well, there'll be some people that will be working for the light plant, but we'll spend a certain amount of time on the broadband business. So that would be shared staffing, and there'll be a piece that would be dedicated. We tried to allocate rent, and we tried to allocate a dollar amount to what the broadband would pay to the smart grid. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So basically, we came up with a model that said we would start with a certain dollar amount per month per connection with a minimum of $2,000 per month. So it's the greater of $2,000, or I think it's $20 per connection per user per month. So if you get to 1,000 users, that number should have gone up. And I actually don't remember if the model, that was the way we designed it. We put some reserves in, and then send down here were the number of installed users, which is a duplicate of this row, the income, the interest expense, the balance, and you can see the balance, of course, at the front end of this goes negative and keeps going negative for some period of time. And then it looks at the delta of that balance, to try to get a sense of how it's trending, and then the first year expenses. Here are some other assumptions. We assumed interest rates were much higher then, or maybe it's not that much higher. Staffing costs, bandwidth costs, and so forth these are all part of the assumption portion of the sheet. This is one of the assumptions we made, which was the cost of the endpoint install. And so what we looking at it two different ways because one was based on profile looking over a period of time, and one was based on a fixed install, including the network terminal that's in the home, optical cable, terminators, blah, 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 and the install labor cost. We came up with a number somewhere between, and then in this column, it's actually net of what the customer would pay. I don't know why these two columns are different, but in essence, in the $1,500, $1,600 range of what it would actually cost to connect a customer. And so that, again, this would be something that would be interesting to see what the real number was. I think that's actually not too terribly far off. One assumption that we made that I don't know that was factored into the model, but I noticed to it was we thought that the network terminal that's in the house would have a useful life of 36 to 48 months. And my note here is that because most of the ONTs are installed inside the building, my belief is that life is actually considerably longer, maybe 10 years or more. Because the fiber, at least in most cases I'm aware of, the fiber comes right inside the building, and then the ONT's inside. We looked at the possibility of using an external ONT, much like if you have the old style phone service, that demarc box is outside the building. This was a stab at the estimate of what the head-end equipment would cost. Again, this is probably not terribly relevant at this point, so I'll just move on. This was really, we worked with Tony Legabo, who was a longtime finance director at Concord, and tried to come up with a fair model of the reimbursement. In other words, a broadband allocation to smart grid. The issue is to try and isolate the payers from the liability of the broadband, cost and liability of the broadband services. So the actual cost of the smart grid was $4 million. For this model, we used a depreciation rate of 3%, so $120,000 depreciation across that $4 million. Percent absorbed by the broadband as a minimum, so that would be the 24,000, which is how we got to the $2,000 per month model. And then we tried to, again, because the model peaked out around 500 to 800 users, it was below where we are. We said, well, what percentage of the total possible endpoints is the broadband consuming out of that smart grid? So again, maybe one of the key things out of all this is that a lot of the assumptions of this business model were built around a penetration rate that was much lower than we're talking about, a penetration rate that was below 1,000 users. Again, it's probably, that was done primarily as the business focus was on how do we get it to the point where it's cash neutral, paying for itself, get it off the ground without having it become a huge liability for the town. So I'm going to stop there and just open up the model for a second. If anybody has, so what it might be worthwhile to do is just scroll across the install profile. So we actually showed it potentially going down in some scenarios. And maybe the best way to look at it is here. Apologize for the scrolling around. This is kind of why I put some of the stuff into the PowerPoint. Was, thinking from 2013 to 2020, what the install profile was. And it looks like for this profile model, we quite literally stopped installing at 500 for the purposes of this model. So again, this model was built on this notion of how do we get it to a point where it's paid for itself and it's paid back the debt, not to just continue to grow it. And then, of course, we thought that it would be reevaluated out here. So that's the nature of that. This was the personnel cost, which was based on the published personnel cost of different people in the organization. We took the midpoint and then made some estimates off of that. This is the detail of the original estimate, original budget for the smart grid and the actual. So you can see the actual is $4 million that was invested in the smart grid. And this is where all this came from. It's interesting anecdotally that the materials, meaning that I'm assuming this is the optical cable itself, is about $1 million out of the 4. And it's likely that that was only increased by a fairly small percentage by adding all the extra fiber in the cable. So that's kind of how the benefit that we have. The smart grid put the infrastructure in place, but they had the wisdom to pull extra opticals through it, and extra fiber cables. And so we took advantage of those for the smart grid. And then this is not relevant, but this is the timeline that we kind of put together when we might do a first customer connect based on town meeting in April, get started in December. Of course, at this time, we actually didn't realize how difficult it is to do installs in the winter. So this model doesn't really comprehend that at all. Any questions, or should I go on to the other side of this?
I have a question. So you talked about this smart grid. I guess I'm not 100% clear, like exactly what that means. And is it completed? Is it?
Yeah. Mark, do you want to answer this? I can talk about it, or you can.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So it's the initial smart metering solution that CMLP has deployed already and is still running, takes advantage of actually the outdoor ONTs mounted on poles to create a node in the network. And one of the things that we probably didn't quite understand or sort of used a little bit differently is there's only about 80,
right,
85 of those. So in turn, you saw the number, there were sort of 8,000 endpoints designed into this network. And of those endpoints, only about 80 of them are actually smart grid fiber connected nodes. And then the communications to actual meters and load control devices at electric customers' premises was done wirelessly through a combination of Wi-Fi and Zigbee. So there are around 500 of these Wi-Fi repeaters that are also installed outside. But that was kind of the anchor application that the network was designed to be able to support. It's another interest that, yeah, that's a map of it. Thank you. Well, actually, no, that's a map of the cabinets. But
yeah,
roughly, there were several of these cabinets in different places. It's probably useful to understand about that is actually not an application that uses the internet. It takes advantage of the fiber optic network to create a territory-wide private network. So, bandwidth costs, for example, are irrelevant because it's A, low bandwidth, and B, all internal to the CMLP-owned fiber. The traffic between these meters and these load control devices just goes back to servers at CMLP essentially, and never leaves the network in the first place. So it's a slightly different application, but it was important, and it was an important role for the telecom team to both support and maintain that network on the CMLP fiber. That said, the fiber itself for all those other 8,000 potential endpoints is in fact CMLP's. It was paid for using electric funds, and it did seem to us at the time, and it still makes sense to some extent, that that some provision needs to be made for as that becomes a small part of the network usage, and other users get bigger, that they should be contributing at the very least to the depreciation of the whole fiber plant and the maintenance of the fiber plant. And so some recognition of what that expense should be flowing back from the telecom service to the fiber plant seemed to make
Yeah.
sense.
So
I
for
would-
you can see
yeah.
here in this row 14, if you, as I scroll out to the right, that number begins to increase. Not hugely, it gets up to $2,500 a month. But Gail, I want to make sure your question was answered. So I just want to say it again, the smart grid was installed at the cost of $4 million. It's an overlay of fiber optic cable that exists around the town. Off of that overlay are 80 access points, which are Wi-Fi or Zigbee based. So at each one of those access points, there's a Wi-Fi router or Zigbee router or both that goes from the fiber optic overlay to a wireless, one of those two wireless technologies or both. And then Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, many of our streetlights also have a wireless access. So if you drive around town, you'll notice a fair number of the streetlights have an antenna that's about 6 to 8 inches sticking out of the top of it. That's part of the private network that's part and parcel of this smart grid that allows the smart grid to communicate with the lighting system as well as with smart meters, which is the Zigbee Wi-Fi piece. But the one thing to mention about all this is the data rates involved in this are very low. And it doesn't go out to the outside network. It's just a private network, as Mark has indicated.
Yeah, that helps. I guess so it sounds like the fiber optic network, the broadband network was built sort of, I don't know, in conjunction or sort of on top of or alongside the smart grid. But is there additional relationship going forward? Like, is the smart grid going to expand? Is the smart grid going to do anything, or can fiber broadband just kind of keep expanding irrespective of smart grid? Does that make sense, the question?
Yeah.
Well, the latter is definitely true. The fiber network can continue to expand kind of without much concern for the way the smart grid works. My understanding of the current planning that's going on right now for AMI, the advanced meter infrastructure, is that once that whole RFP process goes forward, whatever solution that is selected for that will replace over time the existing smart grid, which in fairness turned out to be not everything that it was expected to be. I happened to be serving on the town finance committee. This was ahead of the time that I even went to work for the town, when the light board and the light plant came to us looking to build the smart grid in the first place. And if that was in, I want to say 2004 or 6, something like that. It was kind of a while ago. And the sort of promise of what this was likely to be able to achieve, and what it actually did achieve, and the actual difficulties that came about deploying it, suggests that probably, I completely agree that it should probably be replaced with something that flat out works better. In fairness to the vendor that sold the system, they always felt that Concord didn't deploy enough. They only put in 1,000 or so. I've forgotten the exact number, but the number of actual smart meters. It was designed to be a fully meshed system, and because it was relatively sparsely deployed, it wasn't as able to communicate as they claimed it would be had it deployed more fully. So that's it's kind of a sordid history in there, but that's a little bit of background on it.
Yeah, maybe another way to say it, Gail, is that so the smart grid preceded the broadband by some number of years.
Yes.
3, 4, 5, 6, I don't know, somewhere in there. So as the broadband came to this, which was, we have an opportunity to do the broadband at a particularly much lower cost than if we did it outright. And maybe in round numbers, the way I think of it now is if we had started from scratch and wrote the check for everything for our broadband today, it would be the $4 million that's the smart grid plus the two loans we've done plus the subsequent $1.9 million less what we paid down. So I think that right now that's like 4 million plus 1.9 for the most recent loan and about $500,000 outstanding from the original loans that we have invested in the broadband. If we had done it from scratch, greenfield completely. The broadband business model had the leg up of being able to rent this infrastructure from the light plant that already made this investment for the smart grid to the tune of $4 million. And so our cost, that's why we were kind of concerned to make sure that we were very clean on that issue of making sure that we allocated funds going back to the light plant and the ratepayers, because we were using a $4 million asset, and we thought we should darn well. Tony was pretty clear and adamant about this particular issue, and that's why I kind of bring it up a couple times. Obviously he's retired now, but that we need to make sure that we were keeping the broadband business at arm's length financially from the ratepayers and light plant.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Let me just go through a few more things real quick, just ones of interest. This is what we were just talking about. What we wrote in the business plan was says we're going to use a grader of either 2,000 months or $10 per installed endpoint. I don't know that that's being done, but that was what we recommended as part of this. We did say the grid has a capacity of carrying upwards of 8,000 endpoints, depending on the location and distribution file. So that kind of goes to the fact that there's a lot of dark fiber that's part of the smart grid that we can take advantage of for broadband. And, I think we've all talked about that quite a bit, about all the opportunities to install where the cable already passes the property. This was out of the front end of the plan, and first and foremost was no risk to cost or liability to the taxpayers of Concord or the light plan ratepayers. That was kind of front and center in the development of this plan. And so I think it's a different goal than we have today, which is to try and get service to 100% of the folks. This was a very much more focused on not create a hole in the ground with which we had to pour money. And then more altruistic things like provide an infrastructure, provide cost savings. There's a profit motive, and there was an opportunity to develop jobs for the municipal, and which it did. The plan, when we did the business plan, we actually evaluated a number of different scenarios of how much service we would provide. Everywhere from what was actually happening now was dark fiber. Mark, I think the town was willing to lease dark fiber for.
Yeah, there was some limited leasing going on.
So those kinds of things were happening before
Still
the broadband even came into play, but it's, very much you had to provide all the infrastructure, the network connections, the endpoints, and so forth. And then we looked at things such as basic bandwidth services to key endpoints, which is town, school, and enterprise zone. And then the next step up, which is really fundamentally where we're targeted now, which is this upwards of 7,500 endpoints with bandwidth services only. And I'll talk a little more about that. We looked at telephone service. We looked at ISP. We actually looked even at providing program content, and decided that wasn't, based on conversations with Braintree and others, that wasn't a good idea. So we didn't pursue that. So these are the kinds of questions we were trying to answer in the days of ginning this thing up.
Yeah. So go back to that chart for just a split second. I just want to make a comment. So all the things that are labeled now are things that actually got done. And in addition to that, under basic bandwidth services, you could add that there are certain, mostly businesses around town and some not-for-profits that are taking advantage of bandwidth services again. So some of the private schools, for example, have leased bandwidth from Concord Light to interconnect buildings that are in multiple places around the community. So that's been a helpful thing that the town, for town operations, has also been able to take very good advantage of that. which leads to a lot of operational savings, which turned up in different places. So, I think that most agree that the top three ideas that involve telephone or video services and stuff like that don't really make sense for an operation operating at this scale. And so, those have never been pursued, but certainly the bottom four with the addition of what we call private VLAN, which is a technical term, but it means connecting multiple endpoints over the fiber network, has been a really useful and helpful ability that the school department, the town have taken a lot of advantage of, and some businesses and other organizations have also been able to use. Yes, Gordon.
Yeah, could you explain what the last two terms are, lease, dark fiber, and right-of-way lease?
So that involves the ability to create a fiber optic path between our endpoints on the network and allow some third party, in this case it would be another telecommunications utility, to attach their own equipment to it and pass whatever data they want through it. And when you talk about leasing dark fiber, what you're really doing is saying, I don't know, I have no idea what you're putting through that fiber, but you're giving 100% of the theoretical capacity of the fiber optic cable itself to somebody. And those leases are typically done by the fiber mile. In other words, one fiber per mile per month is the charge rate for that.
As an interesting example of that kind of business is the company, I think it's Williams or somebody else, that does a lot of the oil pipelining around the United States.
Mm-hmm.
They laid fiber down the right of ways where their oil pipelines are, and then lease that fiber to the Verizons and MCIs and Bell Labs and everyone else in the world. But it's usually it's very high level business to business kind of commitment. It's not an individual, and not even many businesses will get into the world of dark fiber leasing. So
we took advantage of it as a way to, for example, some large, let's call it really large medical institutions that happen to exist in Concord, wanted to deal with third-party telecommunications providers that were much more capable than Concord Light, but they didn't happen to own any fiber in town. So they met us at the edge of town, and we provided dark fiber to the premises of in the Concord location and charged them for that few miles of connectivity. The nice thing about that was that caused those same utilities to pass through our central office with signal, which allowed us to then also purchase bandwidth from those same entities at much, much less expensive rates than we initially started out. So it was useful for us. From an availability perspective, most people are familiar with the idea that you want route diversity because you don't want your services dug up by some backhoe or something. And it allowed us to ensure that the connections that we made were diverse, at least so far as they, in our town, because we actually knew exactly where they were because we had installed them ourselves and provided these, given these providers access to it. So it was a way to use a capability that we ordinarily wouldn't be big enough to make much advantage of, both to our advantage and also to service some customers whose needs would have been well beyond anything that CMLP could ever provide.
Great. Let me go on to the rest of these. I'm trying to get through them pretty quickly. So this is again from the report, but I think it was kind of an interesting thing. So one of the things we kind of identified, which was the current business model for power from the light plant, which is essentially provides a connection from the head end to the end user. It provides maintenance for that and connection and management. It purchases that power on the US market and delivers it to the end customers. And basically the light plant operates fundamentally as a cooperative for the customer. What our business plan proposed is the broadband is essentially the same model, meaning we provide a connection from the head end, meaning the internet peering device. We manage that infrastructure and essentially provide the pipe and the bits instead of electrons for power to the end users. So we felt that was a very good synergy from a business model and use case. This was actually something interesting. There are actually a number of different towns that were back then involved in doing their own municipal broadband. We did spend a fair amount of time with Braintree. The other ones we didn't spend as much time with. I don't know that Shrewsbury was actually successful in getting theirs done. This was for the purposes of the study, and this, obviously this data is way out of date, but it shows you that it was, our study was very much focused on the single family home aspect of this. Mixed use, or housing, multi-tenant housing was, we didn't focus the radar on it. And that's, maybe that's a blind side on our point, but I think, again, because we were looking for the simplest way to get to the point where it would break even, our focus was on those things that could be easily served by the smart grid, which was already there. I only put this up because this is actually one of the municipalities we studied as a story and what not to do. And Provo, Utah, unfortunately, basically at the end of the day, failed, and they sold the business to a commercial operator after 7 years. And so it's something to bear in mind here. And that's why I think, we very much in the forefront of doing this model and this plan was thinking about how to make sure we avoid having scenarios like this. And this slide was just a little bit about what we thought we should put to place some sort of review team that would monitor the work of the broadband separate from the light plant. But obviously that's, that wasn't the model. So that's pretty much what I had to present on this subject.
Well, I think you're, when you got to the point where you sort of took a look at the parcels and the that chart that was just a couple before the end where it had the parcel types, and that's a really good segue to the next portion of what we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
So this committee, if we think about it, fast forward to 7 years later, or 8 years later, I guess, is really thinking a little bit more about everybody that's sort of not a single family house or an individual commercial entity, and the data that Jill's provided us with and the look that we're taking, I think really actually begins to get at that. And there was a really good reason why the network, which was designed sort of to get to the smart grid, really in that fiber network design in the first place, it really did not actually build, it didn't build and it didn't try to build to these multi-dwelling kinds of environments and it sort of treated every parcel as though it owned a single family. So that's a great place to start. Hi, Jill, how are you?
I'm very well and happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So this is Jill Moonharry.
My pleasure.
She's the real engine room of the GIS department, I think.
I'm it.
I have both the map that you did and all of the spreadsheets up, and I could share them, or if you're set up to share.
I have them up as well, and I'll be
great.
happy to share them.
So what do you think would be best for us to learn and know about what you've provided us with so far?
Well, I will take you through it and show you.
Great.
How about that?
That sounds perfect. Thank you.
If you'll allow me to share the screen, I will.
Yeah, I think you can already.
Look at that, I can. Wonderful.
Yeah.
So now you can see what I have going on. The first thing I wanted to just quickly go through was the numbers at a very high level. There are 3 sets of numbers that I looked at. I looked at the addresses, I looked at the parcels, and I looked at the streets. And this was your request to me, actually. And so it made sense. So we have 9,000 different master address points, and that includes every individual condo, for example. And we've excluded we have some collection points for condos so that we can either see them as one entity or each individual condo. So I took out the one entity parts, which are these main and submains. And we also, seems like we shouldn't include undeveloped or open space. And then when Mark and I were talking, we took out the folks who can't access from Concord. And the main chunk of that is Nathan Pratt, which you can only get there from Acton. So we took out those numbers, and that leaves us with 6,000-ish master address points where fiber is available. And not everybody's bought it yet, but hopefully they will. And then there are a couple of chunks of numbers where it's not available right now. And this is, I think, your target area. So the fiber's in the street, but the address says it's not available. So there are several neighborhoods and some individual places where this occurs. So it's there, but for some reason we can't connect to it. I don't know those reasons, unfortunately, but the broadband folks in the municipal government do, I hope. Maybe Mark knows. And then there are 130 points where there's no fiber in the street. And I'll just give you a brief look at the spreadsheet that is associated with that shortly. And then we have 313 streets where it's available. We have 20 where it's not available, and 38 with that kind of interim situation of the fibers in the street, but some part or all of that street doesn't have access for whatever reason. And then there are a few partial portions scattered in here. I've taken out, again, the few streets where you can't connect from Concord.
But
and there are also a couple with.
Can I ask a quick question about that? Why, since those
Sure.
are citizens, this is a general question about this, that subject matter. Since those people pay taxes in Concord, shouldn't we keep them in? Question mark.
That's up to you.
Mark, thoughts?
Sorry, I was on mute. I didn't hear your whole question, Scott. Can you
My question is that Jill has eliminated properties which you can only access from another town, but are in the town of Concord.
Mhm.
Like say from, I think she mentioned Nathan Pratt, you can only access from Acton. But why would we want to eliminate them from our consideration? They are Concord residents and they pay taxes in Concord. And if we're trying to reach fiber to every Concord citizen, wouldn't we want to consider them?
Yeah, the rationale, and I actually need to look at this a little bit more, but there are a few places, and Nathan Pratt may be one of them, that are actually part of Concord, but are actually not serviced by CMLP.
Oh, okay.
And it's primarily because of that. You know, Nathan Pratt, if you is off the corner near Acton and Maynard and Sudbury, where it all comes together. And the only way to get there is to continue down Powder Mill Road into Acton, turn south on Sudbury Road, and then come back up into that corner of Nathan Pratt Way. And I'm not exactly clear, and I may be incorrect in this case, because I think is that where the Muse is?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is that the Concord Muse? Okay, so there is, that's a really interesting story, actually, because, and I'll might share for just a split second, just so everybody knows where we're talking about. In fact, Jill, can you jump over to the map and just bring up Nathan Pratt?
Oh, well, I'm sorry, we don't.
Wait. How about let's let Jill
Yeah.
run through her notes
Yeah.
here and
Yeah.
explain it,
Okay.
and
Good.
let's not take it off
Yeah, so anyway, there's possible construction. We just have to look at it, but
Okay, yeah, I didn't
Yeah.
mean to derail the conversation.
Okay.
I agree. Let's have Jill continue.
Okay, a couple more categories. There are places with no public right of way, like Macomb Farm Lane and the Middlesex School campus. They can still be considered in or out, depending on how you want to do it, but I call them out just as situations. And then there's places where, you know, they're just no developed parcels, or it's part of the Concord Turnpike and where it's ramps. So just kind of move those off to the side. And I'll show you the spreadsheet shortly, although you probably already looked at it. I did enumerate the number of parcels without access and the number of multi-dwelling units without access, so that you can have a total number of units available in terms of opportunity. And then the last thing I looked at was parcels without access. So there's 1,305 address points that don't have access, and that translates to 786 parcels. And that's in the third spreadsheet. So we have, again, address points, parcels, and streets. And I'll take you through just a quick look at what's in each of the spreadsheets. And then we'll go to the map because I love maps. So one of them is street status. And the things that I've included in this spreadsheet are they're all the streets in town, except I think I took out Nathan Pratt by mistake. So it may not appear in the version that you have. But, all the streets are listed here and the number of parcels without access. So if there's zeros, that means they all have access. But if there's a partial or complete lack of access, then the number of parcels involved and the number of units in multi-dwelling units is listed, and the total units. So in this case, it's 2 parcels, total of 442 multi-dwelling units on Abbott Lane, and that's the total. And also there's some street length data for you. So that's in there for all of the, that's called out for all of the streets without access. Okay. And then we have the parcels without access. And the information that's contained in here includes some stuff from the assessor's database. So it includes use codes so that you can tell, you can sort this and analyze it as you wish based on use codes, for example, so you know how much of this is single family or multifamily versus business. So you have the data here to do that, as well as zones, if that's important to you. And finally, we have the
zone is the zoning zone for.
yeah, the zoning zone from the planning department.
Yeah, okay.
That zone. And then we have the master address table, all the address points. And it shows you the status. Is it available? Is broadband available there? Is there no access from Concord, as in the Autumn Lane addresses? Is it undeveloped, or maybe there's open space in here, or fiber in the street, but for some reason that address is listed as not available. So all that data. And the nice thing about all that data, by the way, is that it's easy to grab it all from the GIS, from the mapping system. So that wasn't as difficult an ask as you might think. So the map, which you have a link to, has each of these types of data presented. It has fiber access by address, by street, and by parcel. And it also shows where the fiber cable is installed in the street. If you look at it from a high level, you can see that the green is the streets where there's access. And then there's, let me show the legend. So there's green for yes, there's access. There's red for no, there's not. And then there's orange for it's in the street, but it's not available. And so if we go to a couple of neighborhoods, and when you zoom in, by the way, you also get the address details of available no fiber in street and so forth. So you see how many addresses. So like Partridge Lane, for example, is has it in the street, but for whatever reason, it's not accessible to the addresses on that street. So you can zoom out and get kind of a high level overview, or you can zoom in and get details by clicking on either a parcel. It'll tell you about the parcels without access. And in case of 100 Kais Road, which I happen to click on, there's condos there. So you're going to get quite a number of records, 56 in this case, which is part of your opportunity. Or you can click on an individual address point and find out the broadband status for that. You also can see whether things are apartments or condos. It'll say yes, or it'll say unit, depending. Okay, so that's the overview. Question time.
Yeah. I'm representing the condos, and I'm confused. Could you zoom over to Concord Green?
Concord Green. Where are you? I can't- there you are. There we are. I got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So by this map, it says,
It says the fiber's in the street and it shows that it's there. But it also says that that last few feet is not able to be done right now.
say,
For I don't know what reason.
okay,
So the fiber's there, but the addresses can't access it. I think it means that they'd have to pay money to complete something, but I really don't know myself.
okay.
Mark,
good.
do you know what the situation is there?
Yeah, the reason why I'm confused is that we had a CMLP come out and they did a drawing for, this is what why I'm confused, and it's not specifically probably about Concord Green, is that they indicated that we have fiber within 10 feet of the building.
Yep.
And it's just a matter of trenching to the buildings.
So that could be all that's making that a question mark.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right, great.
Yeah,
Thank
so the purple dashed line going through there is sort of an indicator of the fiber that is either planned or is actually available inside of the sort of complex there. And then, but the fact that there's a question mark on each structure, and I think if we clicked on a structure, we'd see that each structure has multiple units associated with it.
Yeah.
Or maybe
I didn't have each structure individually, but all 230 are
230
shown with the click.
Okay,
show up in one, and that, so that's it. That's an indication that there's some inability to actually complete that.
okay.
But it could
How about
simply be investing in the trenching.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
And to a certain extent, this is the question before us is actually a matter of deciding or agreeing who will pay. And
Mhm.
my reading of the Concord Greed situation is that it's a standoff between the homeowners association and Concord. And I'm not sure it's actually, the ball is actually necessarily in Concord's court with respect to this one particular negotiation. So
And
I don't know.
if you were,
I don't want to divert, but we're getting closer to our survey of residents, and if the survey comes back at a low level of uptake for the service, that is to say, not enough residents are interested in the service, then the standoff becomes a moot point. We will then take the position that we're not going to pay for it, and we won't move forward with any interest. I guess that's the best way of putting it.
Yeah.
yeah,
I'm intrigued by the fact that there's actually fiber optic just feet away from these buildings.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
I have a map right on my kitchen table that says it's literally feet away.
Yeah.
In some locations, not all buildings. Some they weren't sure about, but we're going to move on the results of the survey more than anything else.
Right. And this is one of those cases from our sort of setup where there might be individual residents of the 230 different units there who really very much want the service, but they need, their condo association essentially needs to be involved in fiber in the common area. So that's what we call a third, there's a third party. If you think of the light plant as one party and the subscriber as another party, there's still this third party, which is the condo association that needs to at least be cooperative for the subscriber to be able to actually get the service. And
Right.
You could, if you went up to someplace like Wright Farm Road, which is one I'm slightly familiar with and is relatively nearby to there, that it's that right near the Rotary, that big red outlines area. That's a place where, I'm doing this from memory, but the fiber doesn't go down that condo at all. I'm not sure
It does show.
it shows it. Yeah, it may be planned. It's again, we may need to depend on some further investigation for that. But there's Lee Drive there, which I think is one of those places where the utility was undergrounded but not constructed. And so, some answers for these individual areas are going to, I think that's going to be part of the question, is to, like, Lee Drive is a public street as far as I know, and there's no fiber built there. So that's going to be a CMLP decision, whereas the Wright Farm Road one probably falls more into the category of a Concord Green. There's a condo association. They may need to make some decisions before service could be done. And I think we're going to find, if we start to look at the data that Jill has now provided us, that there are a relatively small number of scenarios into which almost every one of these situations is going to fit. And then I think it's going to be our challenge to start to discuss what's the programmatic solution for that. Is the answer, I think in the cases where it wasn't built when there was no underground conduit, the answer is wait for the undergrounding program to decide to do that. And that's been the answer so far, but is that answer good enough? Maybe yes, maybe no. The Nathan Pratt situation is unique, but I think what the really huge leg up we have is, this is not, this is far from an infinite number of situations. And I think the spreadsheets that Jill has given us along with the map give us a pretty good ability to sort of suss out what the questions really are.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be really interesting just to tally up the number of those orange question marks.
Yeah.
And see how many of them are condos. These are right. And my hypothesis is that will cover the vast majority of those orange question marks.
Right.
Which then there's we could actually, as a committee, as a task force, say that, look, there's a hole in the thinking about this that needs to be filled. And, for instance, you just mentioned there are three parties. There's the ratepayer, the end user, and there's the light plant, and then standing in between is the reluctance of a homeowner. Are there some ways that we could attack that? And what I'm thinking of is, like, hey, and don't hold me to this. I'm not speaking for the light plant or the light board or anything here. I'm just, brainstorming. Is like, well, what if we, as a town, had some kind of funding mechanism that you'd pay in? It could, like, sort of sidestep the board, because it would pay for it on a loaned basis, and
Yes.
then come back and in sort of in the
Gordon.
same ideas of betterment or
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah, I think categorizing it first, and certainly we've already identified this sort of three-party problem with this intermediate party, homeowner association,
Yeah.
landlord. You know, each one is slightly different, perhaps, or maybe there's subcategories there. And I think you're right that once we do that categorization and see the nature of this, you know, scope and nature of those, how many of those are in that category, that three-party category, then the second question is, do we want to offer some mechanisms such as a betterment fund or a loan or an advance, you know, and by the way, part of that recommendation may also come that we do, that decision may be driven by a survey. So Concord Green is already doing that. So if we identify a property like Concord Green, that we assess that there's an opportunity, there's a cost to complete the connection for those, then probably the smart thing would do survey how many people would actually want to connect. And then maybe that is come back onto the, you know, the broadband, it's not the light plan, but the broadband management, whether they want to make that investment and how do we make that investment. Do we fund it out of other subscriptions? Do we do some sort of improvement, I guess a betterment thing that we talked about? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to be clear that once we complete our survey, if we find that a significant number of residents want us, and us being the board and our budget, to make the investment to tie in whatever we have to tie in, then the board would allocate those resources and the impasse would stop. We don't, obviously, I consider us to be a fourth party, the board being the fourth party. We would make the investment, but we don't want to move forward with that investment unless we're sure that the current population wants us to make that investment. So we're kind of a fourth party here.
Yeah, the condo board is the, I guess, the decision maker for the association. And, you know, we definitely have cases where, you know, some property owners, so if you go into the rental situation where property owners have either made a decision, you know, for or against actually implementing the fiber connection from the street into their buildings that allows their tenants or, you know, the occupants there. So condos are one case of that. Rental units are kind of a different case of that. And then, you know, to the broader point about sort of, we can also take a look at it from the services side of things. We know that, and we don't have this information back yet. We also requested some information about the broadband orders. And I was hoping that, you know, coming out of the people forum, Jill, you'll remember, we know who's ever requested service, and some people have walked away when they found that they just needed to dig a trench on their property, again for the reasons we were talking about, that's expensive and it was expected to be done on their own. There's a broader opportunity to look at that and say, well, what would happen if that service was made available, for example, from the light plant, or so that a customer could simply sign up for it and pay for it, but they don't have to actually, you know, get the equipment and do the rental and similar things. And that might actually unlock not only some of these multi-family dwelling units, but also do the other piece that we were talking about, which is increasing the adoption amongst potential subscribers who are yeses on that. Because we need to remember that, you know, of those addresses that 7,131, I think she came up with, that are already yeses, there's a significant number of those people who haven't actually ordered or said yes. And that's another part of our mission here, is to try and discover whether there's something to do to improve the uptake of the already majority that's being passed.
Jill, could you show us maybe at a townwide level how many? I'm thinking red, no fiber in street.
So this is Middlesex. This is Macomb Farm. And those are two special cases where there's no right of way. And then there's just a few other little spots. Like the new part of the extension of Baker Ave. This is the car wash.
Hmm.
And this is the Scottiquid Sportsman's Club. Stacy Circle here. The southern part of 126, and there's just, it's just one house with one duplex and a visitor center for Walden Pond. And then a tiny little bit of the White Pond area.
And a little out at the end of Virginia Road.
Yeah, this little bit wasn't
There's-
built out as far as we know. There's only one property out there.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, that's really interesting. It doesn't it's right now I've sort of categorized it in my mind as these hangers on, which is small number of streets anyways, and probably a small number of residences or
Small number
businesses.
of residents, yes, not
Yeah.
very many.
And then the orange ones. And you know, I'm not really sure, like for instance, Middlesex, that may not get resolved. They are kind of in a way their own entity. So
Yeah.
if they want it, they'll come to us. I don't think it reflects badly on us if they don't want it.
Right.
Oh, and you know, one other thing I was going to say was
And,
I was looking at
and
your
oh,
map.
by the way, they don't pay property taxes.
Right.
Yeah.
Keep that in mind.
You know, the other thing, you don't have the black ones, the black residences on this map, or maybe you just can't see it at this resolution. If you scroll in, particularly at the southern side of town.
Yeah, hang on a sec while I do that.
Yeah,
Oh, the ones.
yeah, you can see it on the, yeah.
Yeah, so
I've noticed,
Pheasant and Autumn Lane.
yeah, and the pattern that I see is that those black ones are always on the border.
Well, that's because we have no access from
Yeah.
Concord.
So,
That's exactly why those X's exist, is because
Yeah.
we have no access.
so my working definition of broadband for all is that if you're a resident, you don't have to have Concord broadband, but if you want to get it, that installation is routine, say, and you might have to trench or something. There's a question of who pays the costs of those. We have a policy for that, which really doesn't necessarily need any revision. And so it's those red ones that I originally asked about a second ago that I was most interested in, because those are the ones for which it's not available.
Let me ask a question. Gordon, does your statement include, the black ones are ones of which we have no right-of-way access? So those would be ones of which do those particular properties buy their power from the adjacent town, or do they buy them from the light plant? Does anybody know?
It's possible that they get their power from, I just happen to know about a factoid about Concord, which is that there are some properties in Concord that do get their electricity elsewhere. And the reason why I know about it is that actually gave us a toehold in that allowed us to actually benefit from green communities. So, so I know it exists. I don't know any of the details.
Nah, so okay.
There are
Yeah.
also.
So I mean, I guess my question is leading to the question of, should we include those that cannot buy power from Concord because they're sort of landlocked, or I don't know what the term you would want to use? Should those be included in our attempt to connect them via broadband?
I wouldn't want to write off Concord Muse yet.
Oh,
That
yeah, I think
looks
that's
to
a very
me-
specific and very large case, which I certainly agree with. We
I
should.
was
Yeah.
gonna mention too that zoom in on Abbott Lane, if you will, Jill.
I actually happen to
one-
know quite a bit about Abbott. My daughter lived
Yeah.
there for some time.
Well, one of the characteristics of that is it happens to be, or I'm sorry, Nathan Pratt is what I meant to say, the Concord Muse. When you So that happens to also be right next to one of the main substations. So the piece of property, just keep going a little bit, that piece of property that's right at the end of that, of the purple fiber line.
Right here.
Right there.
Yeah, I believe that's the electric substation.
Yep.
Well, it
And
makes you
so,
wonder.
Yeah, even though you could argue that you have to go all the way around and outside, you could also buy, essentially from town-owned property, potentially cross the property line and get onto the, Nathan Platte. So that's an interesting.
Which would instantaneously change the color of that from black to orange.
To orange, exactly. So, the point about this, and I think this is, I want to thank Jill again in public, is that the combination of the spreadsheets, which have all these details, and the ability to visualize this in a map, I think gives us the opportunity now to really sort of go through this and try to comprehend it and come up with some strategies and probably some of these cases, these various scenarios that might need to be addressed through some greater understanding of that. So I think that that's it, this first look, which is what it was really important to take. And now I think that we've all got a sense of it. I would encourage you each to, poke around in this, come up with a theory, and sometime in the near future, maybe even as early as next week, we should probably start trying to boil it down to see what those cases and situations are, or what additional, say, coding we might need to have to understand it, because I do think it's a fairly manageable thing once you can visualize what you're looking at.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you so much, Jill.
You're very welcome. It's my pleasure.
No.
And my job.
Yes, Jill, I want to add my thank you to you for all this fine work. This is really great. Lovely.
And you can thank Mark for hiring me in the first place.
Well.
I think we can thank Alan Cathcart for that, actually. But
Well, that goes a long way back.
yeah. So that's it's an impressive amount of data. There are definitely some things to understand about it. I suggest that we individually do that. If anybody has any sort of spreadsheet magic they want to do, I think it makes sense to add Nathan Pratt. The other area that I wanted to just ask quickly about is, I know that the CMLP service area includes Pope Road, and I know that there are some customers on Pope Road in Acton who are part of that. And I noticed that on this map, they don't show up as either yeses or nos, or the fact that
most of them have it available. I think there's maybe one or two, maybe one.
Yeah. And maybe
it's really not a big chunk.
Maybe it's the map extent that I'm looking at, but that's sort of a little bit of an aside, but it captures this concept that the CMLP territory isn't quite exactly the town territory. And to Scott's point, yes, these folks have, as members of citizens of town of Concord, have approved borrowing, but they've actually approved borrowing and operations expenses for something that they're not actually paying for, because of the way the finances are structured, they don't have to pay. They don't get electricity from CMLP. Typically, they don't have to pay for broadband, and so those, it is separated that way. Having said that, there's actually nothing, if it's practical, there's nothing to stop the CMLP from trying to service those anyway. That's just a little bit of a different conversation, and it's an edge case.
Yeah, and Concord would be really cautious about extending electricity service outside of its boundaries, because that can trigger some unwanted consequences.
Yeah,
we don't have those consequences.
Go ahead.
But we wouldn't have those consequences for having our service spill outside of our broadband service spilling outside.
Right. And that's what I was talking about. I wasn't suggesting that Concord extend its electric service, but we do know, in fact, that the Muse actually does get electric service from Concord Lake. So
Could be doable.
I'm not sure what the exact path for that electric service is, whether it goes on through the streets or some other way, but the fiber wasn't built there, which is true. Okay. We're just a couple of minutes ahead of 8 o'clock. I forgot to make an announcement, which was that this meeting was being recorded, and if you didn't agree to being recorded, you should have left before. But and on the subject of recordings, I did contact town staff about when the recordings of our meetings were going to be put, and there's a little bit of a backup in MMM. However, I did send, I think, the clerks for the last couple of meetings. There are raw recordings, which include, all the stuff before the meeting originally starts, and if somebody joins early, and they just trim that off before they publish them. But those could be useful if you do need to reference anything for minutes. So we're hoping to get.
Are we overwhelming them with our the voluminousness of our video content?
Well, there's still a lot of town committees that are meeting on Zoom, and they're trying to put up everybody's stuff.
Yeah, well, it's
So,
great. It's such a valuable resource.
It's great. I mean, I hope it continues, actually. I think it's
Me too.
Yeah. So I'll pause for a minute to see if anybody has any public comments, and then I think we would be ready to adjourn for tonight, with an understanding that we're going to meet next Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Hi, Pamela. What would you like to say?
Thank you. This is very fascinating. I appreciate all of your wonderful volunteer giving that I get the benefit of with this wonderful actual democracy.
Thank you.
David, I applaud the idea that we do need to have a survey of interest in broadband connectivity in Concord Green. However, I want to draw your attention to the very important design of the survey itself. It must be also used to educate people about what broadband connectivity is and where it's available in the rest of the town. Not just be a simple question of how much do you want to pay for this? And I want to point out that we did 2 surveys on electric vehicle adoption, and the first one was essentially useless. It asked the wrong question. How much would you want to pay for EV connectivity? And that's about it.
Pam, you and I can discuss.
Whereas the second one was very useful and actually measured the interest in EV adoption during the future. The light plan itself has had the same issues with surveys about the smart metering system, which is going to be developed by the community. You need to actually have surveys be informative as well as questioning.
If I can just say real quickly, send me any questions you think we should ask, but I think this is off topic for this board. Thank you.
Because otherwise you won't actually get the interest. And there is also the need to allow groups in multi-dwelling units to be able to join if the rest of, say, a multi-dwelling unit doesn't want to.
Okay.
And that would require permission from, like, the Concord Green Board. That is, it's also more financially feasible to join building by building, say, than to build out the whole thing all at once.
Well, send me any questions you think that belong on the survey and we'll take a look at it.
Thank you, Pam. Any other public comments? Hearing none, if we have a motion to adjourn, I think it's just about 8 o'clock.
I move that we adjourn the meeting.
Second.
Okay.
Who moved to adjourn? I'm sorry, I have to put that.
Scott did.
Scott, okay,
And you can write down whoever you want for a second.
okay.
One more quick question.
Yes.
Sorry. Andy's has the broadband at his house on Belknap Street. And apparently the conduit to his house was put in by the town, not him.
Hmm.
So his connectivity to broadband was something he didn't pay for.
Hmm.
I've heard that can
That's
happen
everywhere?
if it can happen if there's a undergrounding effort. The Concord pays for the undergrounding to the house for the electricity. So I don't know if that's the case for Andy, but it could have been. I don't know.
Probably was. Could we have that sort of opportunity with like the multi-dwelling places?
I think
But
that's one of the questions that we'll clearly be grappling with, is what kind of policy or program
Yeah.
could be envisioned that would do that. Is right
Yeah.
now the only undergrounding program that's been in place is the one that says there's a street that used to have overhead utilities on poles, and now those overhead utilities are being moved underground. And then there are some policies that CMLP has followed about what that means for the conversion of the customers along that street that it's decided is a priority for going underground. But I think most of us recognize that there are many parts of town where that would never going to happen. And even on the parts that are targeted for that to happen, it's a 50-year project. And so I think one of the central questions for our particular group is, what happens if, as a citizenry, we don't think that's good enough? I think most of us would agree here that it probably isn't good enough. And so something else needs to be envisioned for that. And we're trying to figure out what that something else is. So that's right on point for what we're trying to do.
right now, what does it cost for somebody who is a homeowner and says, I would like connectivity? Now, what does it cost for the installation when you get up to the cube?
If it's an overhead area, that's the simplest answer, and the wire can come in overhead directly to their property, it costs that subscriber $150, I think, is the installation fee. It might be, and that's what they pay, and it gets installed. If they're in an underground area and they have conduit already, it also
How about
costs.
if they're in an underground area and they don't have conduit?
The cost of putting conduit on their property is borne by the homeowner themselves, if they're not doing one of those conversions. And then after that, it would cost them $150 to have the installation done. So that is one of those obstacles to adoption that we recognize.
And I have a neighbor that told me she did the trenching and she gave me a figure for it. It was less than 1,000, I think, but maybe it was around 1,000.
It very much depends on the situation. I
Yeah.
personally redid my electric service because I was direct buried underground, and it cost me quite a bit more than that to put in conduit for electric and for broadband so that everything could go underground, and that can be quite expensive.
She had to
Concord
cut through
Green
the
has
street
direct
too.
buried.
Yeah,
Excuse me? What?
Concord Green has direct buried.
that's
Electric
one of the
wire.
issues with Concord Green.
It's a real problem.
Yes. Okay.
Hmm.
So, but those are on point for our further discussions. Pamela.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So we were about to take a vote for to adjourn. So I'll just call the roll. David,
Aye.
Gordon,
Aye.
Gail,
Fine.
Scott,
Aye.
Mark Howell, aye. So we stand adjourned until Wednesday at 6:30.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye now.
you.
Aye.
Bye.